While the British were secretly building tanks to break the stalemate of trench warfare, the Germans took a far more radical path, creating a new breed of soldiers whose deeds would haunt every man who heard about them. However, you'll see how they became the victims of their own success, sent on ever more dangerous missions until there was almost no one left to go. This is the story of the Stormtroopers. World War I was not supposed to look like this. When Europe marched to war in the summer of 1914, generals on all sides imagined a war of swift maneuvers and decisive battles decided by cavalry and bayonet charges. But within months, they realized just how wrong they were. The machine gun, quick-firing artillery, and barbed wire made offensive after offensive stall in seas of mud and tangled corpses. The Western Front was quickly formed, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, and froze into a line of trenches that wouldn't move for years. By late 1914, the war had devolved into a brutal equation of attrition. Both sides desperately tried the same formula: days or even weeks of massive artillery barrages to quote-unquote soften the enemy, followed by waves of infantry advancing shoulder to shoulder across no man's land. In theory, the shells would destroy the barbed wire and kill or demoralize the defenders. In reality, the defenders took cover in deep dugouts and emerged as soon as the barrage lifted. The attackers, now silhouetted against the open ground, were cut down by machine gun fire over and over again. Even when an assault managed to capture a trench line, the surviving attacking units were too battered to hold it for long. The enemy would counterattack within hours, driving them out again. And so, tens of thousands would die for gains measured in yards that could vanish by the next morning. It didn't take long for all major armies to start looking for alternatives, and the idea spread across the front that small, specially trained parties could raid the enemy's trenches with fewer casualties. These trench raiding parties would, under cover of darkness or fog, slip across no man's land to harass or capture enemy troops, gather intelligence, or destroy fortifications. The British, the French, and the Italians all developed their own versions, but it was the Germans who would take the concept further than anyone else. They learned quickly that speed, surprise, and ruthlessness were the key to a successful mission, although it was anything but safe work to do, and you'll now understand why. The Germans began to create specialized Stoßtrupps, literally meaning shock troops, but the British began calling them Stormtroopers, and the name stuck. At first, they were small teams of elite soldiers chosen for their bravery, fitness, and aggression. They would advance in loose, scattered formations rather than shoulder-to-shoulder ranks, which made them harder targets for enemy fire and allowed them to flow through gaps in the line, avoiding strong points and instead striking at weaker, more vulnerable sections of the front. In March 1915, the German High Command experimented with this idea on a larger scale by forming Calso's Assault Detachment. It was an experimental unit of pioneers equipped with unusual gear like bullet shields and body armor intended to protect the men from rifle and machine gun fire as they advanced. The concept looked good on paper, but before the unit could even test this idea, it was thrown in as emergency reinforcements during a major Allied assault, during which half of the detachment was killed. But the idea didn't die, although only the newly introduced Stahlhelm steel helmet would survive into future use, while body armor was discarded. Command of the battered unit was passed to Captain Willie Raw. He reorganized the detachment and reinforced it with a dedicated machine gun platoon, a flamethrower section, and troops armed and trained for brutal close combat. Weapons they carried were chosen or modified to be effective in the cramped spaces of trenches, like light machine guns and flamethrowers, followed by a mix of pistols, carbines, grenades, and tools for hand-to-hand fighting. Raw's reformed unit became the prototype for the Stormtroopers to come. Their first real test came in a planned assault on a French position in the Vosges Mountains in October 1915. The attack was short and surgical. Instead of the usual hours or even days of bombardment before an attack, this time the artillery pounded the targeted sector for just a few minutes before lifting. As the last shells exploded, Raw's men surged forward in small, scattered groups, using shell holes for cover. They hurled grenades into trench bays before the defenders could regroup, then swarmed their trenches, causing complete panic and confusion. The attackers didn't try to overwhelm every position in their path. If a bunker or fortified strongpoint proved too tough, they bypassed it entirely, pushing deeper to cut communications and supply lines. Then, once isolated, these strongpoints could be dealt with later by the regular infantry coming in to secure positions and mop up what was left by the Stormtroopers. That day, the French position was taken quickly, with fewer losses than a conventional assault would have cost. It was a glimpse of a new kind of warfare that promised, at least for a time, to break the deadlock of the trenches. But it was also extremely violent, dangerous, and costly for the Stormtroopers. Now, the Stormtroopers' best allies were speed and shock, and their equipment reflected that. They carried the shorter carbines, and the whole squad was organized with different roles and different weapons. Grenadiers moved with sacks packed with stick grenades that became the unit's signature weapon. Grenades were ideal for clearing trenches, and they would throw them into dugouts as they were passing or into trenches ahead before advancing. The long-barreled Luger pistol with a shoulder stock and a 32-round drum magazine was used before the arrival of the Bergmann MP-18. This was the first submachine gun that gave stormtroopers compact, fully automatic firepower that was particularly effective in trench fighting. Stormtroopers also carried trench knives, shortened bayonets, or modified entrenching tools for the carnage of hand-to-hand fighting that would undoubtedly ensue once they jumped in. A rifle was often too long to be useful, so these shorter, handier weapons allowed them to fight effectively in tight quarters. Some squads used light flamethrowers that had a notorious psychological effect, and defenders often abandoned their positions just upon seeing the flamethrower nearby. All of this equipment was chosen with one goal: to make the squad fast, adaptable, and deadly in close quarters. Stormtroopers trained extensively in mock trench systems, practicing and preparing for real combat. However, nothing could prepare them for the missions they were about to be thrown into. Just take a look at this. A conventional assault was usually preceded by a prolonged artillery barrage. This would soften up defensive positions and clear the barbed wire, but it would also make the other side expect and prepare for the attack. Stormtrooper assaults, on the other hand, were completely different. They would either go under the cover of fog or a moonless night, or even more terrifying, use the tactic called creeping artillery. This was basically a moving curtain of artillery fire that inched forward ahead of them according to a prearranged pattern. This was an incredibly dangerous tactic and required flawless coordination with not-so-accurate artillery, where one short shot could kill you before the mission even began. But this was a very effective tactic, at least when it worked, because it caught defenders completely off guard and gave stormtroopers an opportunity to exploit that. Even poison gas was occasionally included in the opening bombardment, mixed with high-explosive shells, so stormtroopers sometimes advanced and fought with gas masks on. If this doesn't show how dangerous their job was, I don't know how else to put it. But soon these missions would grow more ambitious and include more men, resulting in some horrific battles that you're about to hear. After arriving at the front, stormtroopers would first study the terrain and the enemy positions, learning the locations of wire obstacles and strongpoints. Then, once they had their plan worked out, they would prepare and set for action. Under cover of darkness, they crossed no man's land in loose order, camouflaged and moving quietly. Wire was cut silently with special tools, and gaps were made without alerting sentries. At least they tried to do it silently, because one wrong step or sneeze could bring down artillery flares that would illuminate no man's land. And, well, then your mission was probably over. And many missions ended exactly like this, never to be mentioned so as not to damage morale. Once through the wire, any sentries had to be eliminated quickly and quietly before the main attack moved in. They would then jump into enemy trenches, and the chaos began. Grenades, gunfire, screams in the middle of the night, all of a sudden, and they pressed forward to secure key positions. Each small group acted independently according to the overall plan, and this decentralization of command allowed them to exploit opportunities in the chaos of battle in real time. By 1917, these tactics were showing results. Stormtroopers could break into positions that had resisted much larger attacks, and their raids became some of the most brutal episodes of the war. They were handpicked from the most fit and aggressive volunteers, men willing to take on the most dangerous missions, and their impact on the battlefield was completely out of proportion to their numbers. Now, if there was ever a moment when the Stormtroopers announced themselves to the world, it was February 1916 at Verdun. This time, it wasn't just another small raid in the night. This was a full-scale offensive, and Willy Raw's shock troops were in the very first wave. After a brief but violent bombardment, as the last shells landed, the stormtroopers were already emerging from the smoke over no man's land. The French barely had time to exit their dugouts before the forward trenches were overrun. Germans slipped past the strongest points, not even trying to capture them, and infiltrated deeper into the French positions, cutting communications and sowing confusion behind the lines. Within the first days of the operation, a small raiding party of just 19 officers and 79 men set their sights on Fort Douaumont, the largest fortress in Verdun's defenses. Creeping up under cover, they discovered an undefended way in through an open gun turret. Slipping inside, they found a small garrison caught completely by surprise, and without a single shot fired, the Germans had taken one of France's most important fortifications. The fall of Douaumont shocked the French army. It was a psychological blow as much as a strategic one. Verdun would, of course, grind on for months in horrific slaughter, and the French would eventually retake the fort. But the stormtroopers had proven beyond doubt that their methods could achieve results once thought impossible. From then on, Allied soldiers never knew when or where these assault troops might suddenly appear, and it had a great impact on soldiers' minds. By 1917, the stormtrooper approach had been adopted across the entire German army. Commanders selected the best fighters in each division to form storm sections for special assaults, while veterans of Raw's unit trained regular infantry in the new tactics. The British, having seen the effectiveness of these methods, reorganized their platoons to mirror the German model. The French were cautious and never committed to large-scale storm units, while the Italians had their own infamous equivalent, the Arditi. These were borderline crazy volunteers, often choosing to fight with only knives in hand-to-hand charges. They scared the life out of the Austro-Hungarian troops they fought, but suffered catastrophic losses in their operations. It wasn't rare for entire Arditi units to go on a mission, and for simply no one to return. And then came one of the Stormtroopers' most devastating performances, the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. German and Austro-Hungarian forces launched a surprise attack against the Italian front. The plan began with a short but intense artillery strike, including gas shells and smoke to blind and disorient surviving defenders. Then, as the last shells fell, the Stormtroopers did what they did best. They infiltrated at the weak points, slipping past strong positions and pushing deep into the rear. In hours, the whole front was torn open, and Stormtroopers pushed an astonishing 15 miles deep into Italian territory on the first day. The Italian defense collapsed as panic turned into surrender on a massive scale, with 265,000 Italian soldiers taken prisoner. Another 10,000 were killed and 30,000 wounded in this short action. Among the Stormtroopers was a young German lieutenant who would become famous decades later in the Second World War, Erwin Rommel. With just 5 men, young Rommel encountered a much larger Italian force. Using bluff and rapid movement to create the impression of a far bigger unit, Rommel convinced roughly 1,500 Italian soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender to him. And surprisingly, it worked. Caporetto was such a complete disaster for the Italians that the word itself entered the Italian language as a synonym for total debacle. The Allies, disturbed by what they had just witnessed, began working urgently on ways to defend against such infiltration attacks. However, even this stunning victory was not the Stormtroopers' grandest moment. That, believe it or not, was still to come. It was March 1918, and with Russia out of the war, Germany could finally turn its full attention to the Western Front. This was to be their last all-or-nothing gamble for victory in what would become known as the Spring Offensive, and it would begin with the first and largest blow, Operation Michael, launched just 3 days later. The attack began with one of the most concentrated bombardments of the entire war. Over 6,500 German guns and 3,500 trench mortars fired around 3.5 million shells in just 5 hours, including poison gas. Under cover of fog, smoke, and gas, and shielded by a carefully timed creeping barrage, Stormtrooper units moved forward in small, scattered groups. British sentries who survived the opening barrage never even saw them coming. They slipped through the British forward outpost zones, bypassing or quickly overwhelming the thinly manned positions, then pressed deep into the rear before defenders could regroup, and large stretches of the British line began to crumble. Panic spread in outflanked or surrounded units, with Germans appearing from all directions. Thousands of British soldiers were cut off and had to surrender. And by nightfall, the British had been driven back several miles. For the first time in more than 3 years, the deadlock of trench warfare had been broken, and German troops now stood in positions that had been considered all but impregnable. However, the success came at a horrific cost, and the real battle was actually far from over. In some areas, German forces advanced as far as 40 miles, capturing vast swathes of territory, including towns and villages. But this rapid advance meant Stormtroopers and supporting units quickly outran their supply lines over the cratered, shattered terrain. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements struggled to reach the forward troops. To make matters even worse, the ultimate strategic objectives, the key transport and supply hubs that would deliver the knockout blow to the Allies, could not be captured. And all the while, the Stormtroopers, by the very nature of their role, were taking the worst of the casualties. They were always at the very front, in continuous action for days on end. Those who weren't killed or wounded were pushed beyond the limits of exhaustion, without food and ammunition for days. Unlike earlier operations, where Stormtroopers would break a line and then be replaced by regular infantry, here they were kept advancing without relief until they were simply worn out. In Operation Michael alone, the German army suffered around 240,000 casualties, and the Stormtrooper units bore the highest losses of all. Some battalions were completely wiped out, with all their experienced fighters gone, and no equivalent replacements left to fill the gaps. This meant that the follow-up attacks lacked the same impact because the cutting edge of the German assault had been dulled. By July 1918, the Spring Offensive had ground to a halt, and the initiative passed to the Allies. Now reinforced by fresh American troops, they hit back in the 100 Days Offensive, driving the exhausted German forces into never-ending retreat. Stormtroopers proved just how devastatingly effective they could be, but at a cost so great they became, quite literally, the victims of their own success. By November 1918, it was all over. The war ended, and the few Stormtroopers who had survived were disbanded in the mass demobilization. They returned to civilian life, carrying the memories of the horrors they had experienced for the rest of their lives. Still, the idea did not vanish. The concept of small, highly aggressive, autonomous assault teams infiltrating enemy defenses kept evolving through the decades. We know them today by names like SEAL teams, the SAS, and other elite units around the world, being the modern-day high-tech trench raiders.